Welcome to the Daily Objective. We are back in our usual format of doing this on Zoom, although I'm sure we'll be back to doing it live soon enough. I'm here with Mark Pellegrino, and today we're going to be discussing what was the title? The Complete Idiot's Guide to what was it? Defeating Israel. And there's basically a bunch of stuff in there about that we're going to discuss, and this is going to be a shorter than usual episode. We are going to try to keep it to the original plan of having the Daily Objective be a 20-minute show, because I have to go run the London Ayn Rand meetup in an hour at a different location. So but yeah, so you may have seen in the news, and you may have not, because it's not headline news when Israelis are killed, but there have been quite a few terrorist attacks in recent weeks against Israelis. Israel has not really responded militarily. It did what it usually does, which is talk about, how severe a military response the Palestinians will experience if there's more of it, and that never happened. But also Israel's bizarre coalition, which we've spoken about on this show in the past, it looks like it's in trouble. So it's a coalition that had 61 members of the Israeli parliament, of the 120 members. So it's as small a majority as you can have. And one of those 61 has now left the ruling party, which had, I believe, 6 seats in parliament before that, now has 5, or had 7 and has 6. Left over, that's also not very clear, but either the terrorist attacks or some combination of the terrorist attacks and the fact that in Passover, the health minister has decided that in hospitals they will be giving food that is not kosher for Passover. Passover has its own kosher rules, and if you're in an Israeli hospital during Passover, you will be able to get some food that doesn't follow these rules. Which one quote I saw from her was, "Not on my watch." So interesting things going on in Israel. This government could be in trouble, and if it's not in trouble, I guess the people of Israel are in trouble. And if there's a replacement, that the second part isn't actually going to change. So, Mark, you follow Israel closely. You've expressed your views and have received a fair amount of trolling over them. What are your thoughts, either specifically around what's going on now, or generally?
Yeah, my thoughts are more general. I think the minutia of what's going on politically, the dynamics politically of that parliamentary system over there, and I'm certainly less clued into that, and not really sure how that fits into the global scenario of the world impression of Israel. But my point of view is the opponents of Israel at the moment, or for the last several years that I've been engaging them since 2014, seem to have the moral high ground, and I think they're using the dominant ethics that are around the world to capitalize on incidents over there, and to manipulate those incidents into their favor. And I've noticed a sort of consistency in the movement in the United States, sort of stemming from cultural Marxism, to break confidence in Western civilization and democratic institutions, with the purpose of morally breaking the moral constitution of the people, so they no longer fight for what they want, to be as prevalent, probably there, at least on social media, as it is here, so that it's very difficult for people to fight for something that they don't morally believe in. And I think that's one of the tactics used by the opponents of Israel, is to attack Western culture, anything that stems from it, and to demoralize the population into thinking that anything that came from Western culture, democratic institutions included, are just as bad as any other government out there, or just as worthy of sovereignty as any other government out there. And that's one of the tactics some of the opponents of Israel use to demoralize any defenders of Israel. I've also found they decontextualize military retaliations a lot. They exaggerate and conflate things that have a sort of facile similarity to other government trends in other parts of the world. For example, the fact that there's a wall in Israel separating Palestinians from Israelis gets conflated with apartheid Africa. Again, just attempting to sabotage the moral confidence that people can have in their cause, and usurping it with this moral high ground that doesn't really exist.
Yeah, I think the issue of Israel's conflict with the Palestinians and the political movement supposedly supporting the Palestinians. It's an anti-Israel movement. It's not pro anything. That movement and the people who choose that as their issue are some of the most despicable people in political activism in the world, because it's, of all the issues and of all the conflicts of anything you see in the world, if you zero in on the Middle East and then you choose of those two sides the side that is relatively free rather than the side that is still barbaric and primitive, then that says a lot about these activists. Now, the moral sort of foundations of those views are very similar, unfortunately, to the philosophical principles guiding most people in the world, including Israel. So we see Israel's moral relativism, with the prime minister who's now in political trouble. A few weeks ago, at least to Israelis, he was being sold as the person who's going to bring peace to Ukraine. And that's because he was pretty much neutral about that issue. And the explanation for Israel's neutrality on the war in Ukraine is that it's some political issue with Russia and how Russia can harm Israel. And Russia has been harming Israel since the beginning of time, since Israel first established itself as an independent state. Russia has always sided with Israel's enemies. It still does to this day. I mean, we have these, while the world is impressively taking the right side on the war in Ukraine, there are still negotiations with Iran on, how can we pay them off to not build their nukes that will obviously be targeted at Israel. So it's a shame that Israel clearly has the moral high ground and doesn't understand it and can't really claim it.
That's because the confidence in their institutions and what they stand for has been eroded. There's so much equivocation on the other side. Unfortunately, they believe, the Israelis and many people in America believe the propaganda. And you're right, it's exploiting a dominant ethics. It's exploiting the prominence and moral stature of victims, and the idea that if you're poor and benighted, it's likely because somebody big and powerful is depriving you of the capacity to make your life better. None of which is actually going on in Israel, but the extreme conflict of images, the juxtaposition of something a city as thriving as Tel Aviv and Gaza in its poverty and overpopulation. It's difficult for people to grasp that those causes and effects are not what they think they are. It's not these dominance structures that we've grown up thinking exist. It's a result of values, and it's a result of something good that's been disparaged for many, many years.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, we see these movements, sort of the anti-Israel sentiment grow around the world, and especially it's especially troubling when it's in America, because Europe, as much as I hope to be wrong about this, I think the way Europe will be better is if it takes the lead from America, or follows America's lead but not the way America is today. I think it's actually going the other way around, and America is uh, becoming more like Europe philosophically. And Israel, a good example of Israel's kind of moral relativism is the coalition government that is now down to 60 of the 120 members, and it'll be interesting to see what that turns into, because this is so the prime minister Naftali Bennett is supposedly to the right of Netanyahu, and Netanyahu is supposedly center right. And Bennett was one of those people who always criticized Netanyahu for not responding strongly enough militarily to terrorism. And of course, he's now doing nothing. Why is he doing nothing? To give him like the benefit of the doubt, it's because he can't, because of the coalition he leads. So anything to do with the platform on which he ran would mean the end of his government. He can't rule with this coalition doing what he promised voters he would do, because his coalition is full of parties that are pretty far to the left. There's an Islamist party in there that historically would never sit in a government, in a coalition. They are opposed to the very existence of the state of Israel, and somehow they're a part of the coalition. And this coalition came about just because of anti-Netanyahu sentiment. They wanted to get rid of Netanyahu, and that in and of itself was not a bad idea, because Netanyahu was not good as prime minister. But that's all they have in common, and that's all that's been holding it together. And this woman who now left the coalition left because she was promised a seat in Netanyahu's party, a seat in his government. She was promised I think she was promised health ministry, if I'm not mistaken. So, and this is how politics works in Israel. You basically, nobody ever gets a majority, and the way you form a government is you buy off politicians with promises of prominent roles.
I mean, it's more obvious in the parliamentary system, but it seems to be the way they do politics out here now as well.
Yes, but you elect a president for 4 years, and that's the president. Like there's no,
Right.
the Senate can't. They can, but they need very good reason to get rid of a president, and even then, it's not like it's going to be the next person in line who was elected with the president. So.
Well, I think as we've seen from the last two impeachments, it's not necessarily true that they need a good reason to displace the president. They just need a consensus. They need people who are believing the same story.
Yeah, but I mean, he wasn't removed from power, so impeachment in and of itself is not even that much of a thing. It's kind of a symbolic gesture. And
impeachment by the House, true, but a conviction from the Senate would have been unprecedented and a real thing.
Yeah, and then somebody from the same party would be president. So it's definitely a more stable situation. I mean, in Israel, there was, in what was it, a 2-year period, there were 4 general elections, which is unprecedented for Israel, and 3 of them were within a year. And I think it's been less than a year from the last. I don't remember when exactly the last one was. It was sometime last year. But yeah, this government, which it's possible it will collapse in the next few days. That might lead to another election. So the political system in Israel is very unstable. When there is some stability, it's being paid for by the buying of politicians. So, and that's always a bad situation wherever you are, but it's a deadly situation in a country that is surrounded by enemies that just want to annihilate it. So Yeah, I think.
Indeed. And what is the, well, this is a terrible way to phrase this question, but why is it a mark of a free country to allow parties to exist on the political sphere that seek the destruction of the socio-political world in which they inhabit? Like I think I thought it was a totally rational move when it was in the 1950s or it might have been earlier, to ban the Communist Party, to ban it from any political action. And I think it would be appropriate for Israel to do the same with Islamicists if they are not only against the state of Israel and the welfare of Israel, but against the democratic system itself, which they're just exploiting for their own purposes. Why don't they ban these parties?
I don't know. I definitely think in some cases in Israel, these parties should have been banned. If not the parties, then individual politicians. And in quite a few of the cases, or not quite a few, several cases, somebody served in parliament for a while. There was one who disappeared, and it was later discovered that he was on the payroll of Hezbollah, I think. And there was another one who was on the payroll of Yasser Arafat and was serving in parliament like after that and during that. And yeah, I guess this is some package dealing of free speech where free speech means you have the right to implement whatever ideas you have, which of course you should not have if that means violating somebody else's rights.
Yeah, the West really needs to get straight on this. They really need to get straight on this. Israel especially, since they're surrounded by people who hate them. Do you think that Israel's got a limited life?
Yes.
Given the international hatred of it, and then massive disinformation campaigns that go on, and the people who the manpower harnessed in Malaysia, and the hatred I see online from Ireland and other parts of the UK for Israel. They think they're fighting for the David in the David and Goliath power scenario. And I don't see any concerted opposition to that. Not really.
Yeah, I do think Israel has a limited life. I don't know exactly how limited it is, but yeah, I would not be surprised if in my lifetime Israel ceases to exist. And I don't think it's because of the hatred around the world. I think if Israel stood up for itself, as it did in the past when Israel stood up for itself, it was admired around the world. So,
but I don't. But I think the world has changed. I think philosophically and morally changed. Standing up for yourself now is a mark of weakness, especially if your opponent is smaller than you. If your opponent has the audacity to be poor and small and pick a fight with you, and you're big and strong and have the capacity to annihilate that, you're the one, the onus for all the violence, and so the proof of the weight, the burden of evidence is on you, not on them. They can do any savage thing they choose because of their moral or because of their socioeconomic position, and you are shackled as far as the world is concerned.
Yes, but I also think a strong Israel would could revive some of that idea of I want to say hero worship or something to that effect. Like if Israel actually stood up for itself properly, it will I think it will gain admirers. Now it'll still have the people who hate them, but right now Israel is looking to pander to those people. Whenever you see a military operation in Gaza, you'll see spokespersons for the IDF saying Israel is the most moral army in the world. And when they explain why that is, it's because it sends soldiers on ground operations where they know soldiers will die in order to prevent civilian casualties on the other side. So if you have a situation where you can win it easily from the air, but possibly civilians will die.
We're infected with that same just war virus in America too, and it's degrading to self-esteem, and even to express that an army is good because it doesn't regard its own citizen safety as paramount, but the enemy's safety as paramount, is just morally degrading. So, I mean, to me, pretty much all of Europe supported Israel in the beginning when they were weak and small. But once they started to defend themselves aptly against their enemies, they started to lose that support, I think, because, the moral landscape is what it is. And I think expressions of strength aggravate people. I mean, most people who buy that ethics that, if you're rich and powerful, you got there by stomping on somebody's neck, and, a little comeuppance from the other side is not a bad thing. It's actually good. And I think many people look at the Israel-Palestine dynamic in that way. And I think Israel's not doing much to combat that, other than acknowledging the morality, the moral high ground of the other side and attempting to appease it, which I think is a terrible mistake.
Yeah. And ultimately, I mean, either way, however the world might react to Israel standing up for itself, if it doesn't stand up for itself, it will lose. I mean, ultimately, the other side, and the other side is not just the Palestinians. It's easy to look at it that way, because then you can see the Palestinians as supposedly weaker. If you actually look at the landscape of enemies that Israel has in the Middle East, Israel is also the weaker side in that. But if it doesn't stand up for itself, the enemies will continue to get stronger. Israel will continue to get weaker, and it will,
look, and they're relentless. They think they have the moral high ground, and they see an end to this, an end where Israel is pushed out of existence, and they, quote unquote, take over or take back what was theirs. That's the way they look at it. And I don't know does Israel have the same resolve? I don't know. I don't see it online. I see individual Israelis and Jews fighting for something rational. And I see hordes of the opposite side relentlessly attacking, exhausting. They're an exhausting group of immoral boneheads.
Yeah. So no, I don't think there's much of that in Israel. I think there's actually the people who are the most clear on their support for Israel within Israel are usually on that side for religious reasons. So yeah, there's not much hope. And on that optimistic note, I think we need to wrap up. Thank you, Bonnie, for the super chat. Tomorrow we have a more optimistic show, because we will be talking about the week we had in London. Tomorrow's the Thursday Collective. So Mark, it'll be you, Jonathan, Raka. Maybe I'll join that as well, and we will talk about the week we had in London and what we can do, how we can do it again in the future.
And I'll be listening to the week that I missed.
Yes, and hopefully we'll be convinced to join us next time. Although I know you wanted to and weren't able to. And we have, since it is the day of the London Ayn Rand meetup, we don't have any shows in the next few hours. But at 10 p.m. UK time, 5 p.m. Eastern, Cutting Edge with Lee Pearson, part 2 of the show on affordances and perceptual inerrancy, with guest Harry Binswanger once again. So,
that's a mouthful.
Yeah. I remember Nikos talking about part 1 of that and saying, I don't know 2 of the 4 words in that title. That's true of me as well, but I think I hope I pronounced them correctly. Thanks everyone, and see you back here tomorrow.
Thanks, guys.